Evening guys, welcome to today's video. We're going to be doing a bit of a knowledge blast and rundown of the relationships topic, which is on the paper 3 for AQA psychology. So as I've done in previous videos, I'm just going to run down kind of the core elements of the AO1 content from the booklets that we teach from the specification, along with some examples and exam tips. I will link on the Instagram where to find kind of the PowerPoint summaries on Teams and the resources with the evaluation points as well. But this video is primarily going to focus on knowledge. So if we look at the specification and the way that these booklets are broken down, the very first booklet and spec point that we start with is evolutionary explanations of relationships. Now, the reason that we start with this booklet first is because it's essential for us to understand kind of in terms of us evolving as humans, what is the origin of relationships? Why might we have formed them in the past for survival and reproductive purposes? And then we'll see as we go through kind of the journey of each booklet, how that evolves from biological origins to looking at things such as more modern virtual dating and online relationships. So if we look at evolutionary explanations, it's broken down into kind of 3 main areas. And for each of those areas, we compare the evolution of relationships for both males and females. Now, as it is evolution, it's primarily about 2 key aspects, that being survival and reproduction. So because of those factors, it very much is focused on heterosexual relationships between straight men and women, and therefore doesn't take into account, for example, homosexual relationships or those who maybe don't identify as having a sexual orientation. So when you think about how limiting this sounds, I want you to kind of store those ideas about all the factors it's ignoring, save that for your evaluation. That's a nice, easy AO3 point to bring in, that these kind of very old school evolutionary explanations don't necessarily explain every type of relationship, especially in a modern society. So the first of the 3 areas is looking at the role of sexual selection. And there's 2 different types of sexual selection that you would want to know for the exam. You've got intersexual selection, which is the preferred sexual selection technique of females. And this is all about choosing a mate. Intersexual selection is the idea that we are looking for a partner with specific characteristics, and that we will kind of use that process of sexual selection to identify a partner with those desirable traits in the hope that our offspring, by offspring I mean children, will also then have those same traits. And we kind of nickname this the sexy sons hypotheses. So a really good example of this is the characteristic of height. Height at one point would have been seen as advantageous in terms of survival, and therefore a desirable characteristic. So the more females that sought after a partner that was very tall, they would then start to mate with those tall men, also going on to have tall sons who then have that desirable characteristic that is going to help them get a mate and pass on their genes. So intersexual selection is about mate choice and preference, whereas intrasexual selection is the preferred sexual selection technique of males. And this is all about fighting for dominance. So the idea that members of the same sex compete for kind of access to members of the opposite sex. And that can be either kind of physical fighting for dominance, the way it is in the animal kingdom, or more of kind of a verbal fight for dominance and about establishing your authority and your role. Now, those preferred techniques of inter and intrasexual selection then fall into the next category, which is looking at the reproductive behaviour and parental investment of both men and women. So Triv has identified that females and males have very different parental investment, which impacts the reproductive behaviour and the type of relationships, therefore, that they like to engage in. So females have a much higher parental investment than males because they have a lot more to physically invest into the process of reproduction in terms of the trials and tribulations of becoming pregnant, of sustaining a 9-month pregnancy, of going through childbirth, of doing things like breastfeeding. So there is a lot more physical investments that females need to make. And also we have a lot less eggs and kind of a much shorter time window in which we can sustain a healthy pregnancy. So because of that high investment and shorter time window, it's said that females prefer quality over quantity and therefore are more likely to look for a long-term partner and prefer long-term mating because they want to make sure they're investing their time in the right person that is going to help benefit them when it comes to raising their offspring and their children. Alternatively, the male reproductive behaviour tends to go for quantity over quality, and that's because they have a low parental investment. So in terms of the physical investment that males have to endure during the process of reproduction, it's literally the actual act of having sex, and then their job is done in terms of contributing to that reproductive cycle. So in theory, because they have a lot more sperm, they are fertile for a lot longer in their life in comparison to women, and they don't have that physical burden of carrying a child, they can theoretically impregnate multiple women and therefore pass on their gene to as many people as possible. And because of that low investment and that evolutionary drive to survive and reproduce, they are said to prefer much more short-term relationships, so very kind of quantity over quality, and kind of more casual sex and intimate relationships. The final element that would be referred to within evolutionary explanations is this idea of mate preference. So because of our reproductive behaviour and the way that we sexually select our partners, what specifically are those characteristics that we are looking for? So we've said these are the techniques, this is the reason why we use those techniques, now this is what the actual characteristics that men and women supposedly want. So Wainforth looked at this idea that females prefer a man that has very masculine features such as really dark hair and facial features, a square jaw, ridged eyebrows and a symmetrical face, so that females were looking for very specific physical characteristics that indicated good health and good genes, but also they were looking for resources. They were typically looking for an older man with money who would be able to look after them and their offspring. Again, because that enhances your chances of survival and therefore your children's chances of reproduction later on. Alternatively, a researcher named Singh suggested that males have a physical preference for a younger partner with a waist to hip ratio of 0.7, which is kind of that perfect curvy hourglass figure. Because that indicates that the female is not currently pregnant, but she is past the age of puberty, so she has the physical capabilities to carry a child naturally. And it's also that kind of, again, that body symmetry is a sign of good reproductive health and good genes. So that's what we mean by evolutionary explanations, and then the evaluations for that are very much using research, for example, such as Buss, Clark and Hatfield, or Dunbar's research, and then kind of counter arguments of those evidence to support. You can bring in things like social sensitivity, issues with social desirability bias, based on the sensitive nature and the methodology of the things that we're asking people. So if the question is phrased as outline and evaluate the evolutionary explanation of relationships, or outline and evaluate the relationship between sexual selection and human reproductive behaviour, then anything in that first booklet would be relevant. So they're the buzzwords you're looking for in the question: evolutionary explanation or the relationship between reproductive behaviour and sexual selection. The key thing, if it's talking about sexual selection, that should be the focus of the question and about mate choice. If the question is focusing more on evolution generally, then make sure you also make that link to survival. Booklet 2 is factors affecting attraction. So this is referring not necessarily to explanations of relationships, we come to that in a second, but booklet 2 is about what are the specific things that would make us more or less attracted to somebody, and therefore could impact our ability to want to form or maintain a relationship with that person. So this isn't explaining why we necessarily get into a relationship. This is talking about the things that affect whether or not we are attracted to somebody, both emotionally or on a physical level. And there's 3 named factors on the spec that you need to know and be familiar with. The first one is self-disclosure. This is about the sharing of personal information about yourself to somebody else. And this typically is something that needs to be both gradual and reciprocated. By gradual, I mean going from what we consider low risk information, such as your name, your age, your occupation, kind of, basic facts about yourself that are not too personal, that anyone could find out. They're not risky information to share. Gradually building up in both breadth and depth until you eventually reach more high risk information, which is your secrets, any possible past trauma, or just really personal information about yourself that defines you as a person. So things, for example, such as your political or religious beliefs. The key thing with this one as well is that it needs to be reciprocated. In order for attraction to be built, you need to be able to share information with somebody over time, getting more and more deep, more and more sensitive. But that needs to be reciprocated back. You can't be sharing all this information and getting nothing in return. It needs to feel like you are both comfortable to do the self-disclosure, because that is a sign of trust. And if we build trust with somebody, that helps develop intimacy, which ultimately will make us more attracted to the person, because we feel like we're developing this special bond and that we're getting to know them on a more personal level. So Altman and Taylor would refer to this as social penetration theory, the idea that we are penetrating our kind of selves into the lives of each other by getting to know them on that deep level and kind of breaking down their walls using this social self-disclosure technique. However, if self-disclosure is not done in a gradual and reciprocated way, if you go straight in with high-risk information too soon, for example, or if you reveal something relatively high risk and it is not reciprocated, then that can have the opposite effect. And instead of building attraction, it can kind of really put us off people if they start telling us the deepest, darkest secrets on date number 1, and that's going to be a little bit of a red flag. So it can have both positive and negative effects, but if done in the intended way, it is something that will make us more attracted to another person and therefore more likely to want to pursue something romantic with them. Next, we've got physical attractiveness, which is exactly what it says on the tin. It's looking at the physical appearance of the other person and what are the things that might make us more or less attracted. So we know from the evolutionary explanations that there are certain physical characteristics that men and women look for in terms of their mate preference. However, within physical attractiveness, there was 2 concepts that we looked at. The first one is the halo effect, and this is the idea that naturally society has these unconscious biases that people who are more stereotypically beautiful or kind of more physically attractive in terms of what societal norms and standards believe, we tend to perceive those more attractive people as somebody that is more trustworthy and that is nicer, that generally is maybe more talented, or we tend to have a much more positive outlook and view on people who are attractive, which can obviously create significant biases and allow us to overlook certain potential pitfalls and problems when trying to identify a partner that's right for us. But the most interesting aspect of physical attractiveness is the use of the matching hypotheses. Now, the matching hypotheses is the belief that to make sure that we are satisfied and that we are appropriately attracted to a partner, we tend to give ourselves a kind of a self-rating. So for example, I would say to myself, I am a 6 out of 10, and therefore I need to find myself another 6 out of 10, somebody who matches me on the same level of attractiveness. Because if I go for somebody who is much higher than me in terms of attractiveness, so if I'm a 6 looking for a 9, then that person could be perceived to be out of my league. I would be very insecure by the thought that my partner is significantly more attractive than me. And that might lead to issues around jealousy or potential infidelity. So, for example, being worried about them cheating on you. Whereas, obviously, we equally don't want somebody a lot less attractive than us, because we don't want to be unhappy. We need to feel some sort of physical connection to them. So the belief that the more similar somebody is in attractiveness to you, the more comfortable you will feel, and therefore the more attractive you will find them, because of that sense of kind of comfortability between the two people. The final factor that would affect attractiveness in romantic relationships is filter theory. Now, the key thing here to remember is, even though it is called filter theory, it's not a theory of relationships in terms of formation and maintenance. It is still referring to factors affecting attractiveness. Now, this one's a little bit more detailed because there are 3 elements to it, and filter theory suggests, I always kind of liken this to a little bit like you would on kind of an online dating app, for example. You're kind of narrowing your search and filtering out all the people that are not relevant to you to help you find that pool of people that you might possibly be attracted to. So Kirchhoff and Davies suggested that we start off with what we call the field of availables, and that refers to everyone that we could possibly have a romantic relationship with. And then they pass through 3 different filters, so 3 different kind of characteristics that they need to tick off in order to reach what we call the field of desirables. And that's a much smaller pool of people that we could and hopefully are most attracted to. So the first filter that people will pass through is social demography. Now, social demography refers to the demographic in which that person fits into and how similar that is to your own background. So this is looking, for example, at where the person is from, their cultural heritage, where they live, their educational status, because it's suggested that people that we don't come into contact with regularly, we're less likely to be attracted to them because we're not used as that type of person, and we think it's unrealistic that we would meet them in another setting. So if somebody is from a much more diverse or different background, this theory would propose that we would filter them out, and if they're too different from us in terms of their educational status, their background, if they live too far away from you, then we're not going to be attracted to that, because ideally we don't want to do the long distance thing. The second filter, so if they make it through filter 1, the second filter that they would have to pass through is similarity of attitudes and values. And this is the idea that we are looking for somebody with similar core beliefs to us. So not just on the trivial things like liking the same takeaway or having a similar taste in movies, or both owning a dog, for example. It would be a similarity of attitudes on the core important things. So for example, your values of, are you both think it's important to have an active lifestyle? Are you both people who are very career orientated? Is a family or marriage something that you would both be interested in? And it suggested we filter out anybody who is too dissimilar to us in terms of our core values, and then we would keep people that are more aligned and similar. And then finally, that last kind of filter is what we call complementarity. So this is about the idea of kind of that yin and yang, and whether or not somebody balances us out and complements our needs. So if you're somebody, for example, who is a bit of a class clown and a joker and likes making people laugh, then you'd be looking for somebody who gets your sense of humour and who finds you funny, because both parties are then getting some sort of reward out of the relationship. Alternatively, this can be not just on an emotional level, but also physically. So in terms of physical intimacy, if you're a person with a really high sex drive, for example, you would want a partner that has a similar libido level and kind of matches you on that energy, so that you're being satisfied and your needs are being complemented, but that you are also doing that same for that other person. So complementarity is about emotionally, physically, psychologically, you being compatible with that person and thinking, actually, yeah, we could make each other happy. And again, that needs to go both ways. So if somebody reaches through all three filters and into that field of desirables, they are the people we are attracted to according to that factor. As we move on to booklet 3, this is where we start to look at the kind of how and the why relationships are formed. So we previously looked at kind of evolutionary reasons why we would get into a relationship in terms of reproduction and children. But in these theories, we'll look a little bit more holistically at everything that we might get in a relationship and the reasons kind of for and against forming and maintaining romantic connections. So if we look at the first booklet, this is referred to as social exchange theory. Now, social exchange theory is what we would consider an economic theory of relationships. Economic being that it views love a little bit like a kind of bank balance or a spreadsheet, in that it's very much about making profit. And by that, we don't necessarily mean literal profit in terms of money, but this is all about rewards and costs. So the idea that we as individuals want to minimise the costs that we have in a relationship, so minimise the negatives and the cons, maximise the rewards, so get out of that relationship as much as we can. And the idea that the relationship will only continue and therefore be maintained if the relationship is profitable. So by profitable, you mean more rewards than costs. Now, one good thing about this theory is that it is very much subjective in that it recognises individual differences, and that what might be a reward for me, for example, might be a very different reward to what you would be looking for in a romantic partner. And same with costs. So rewards can be things such as materialistic items and goods. So it might be receiving presents from your partner, being taken on holiday or taken out for date nights, so kind of being wined and dined. Rewards can come in the shape of your partner helping with things like housework, so kind of that what we would refer to as kind of acts of service, so doing things to help you in your daily life to kind of ease the pressure and stress. For example, if you're really busy working. Costs, alternatively, could have a financial element to them if you are financially contributing to that relationship and it's costing you money to help that other person. But costs are more things like time, effort, having to call your partner every day, having to compromise and change plans, things like arguments, having to not always get your own way. So again, that kind of give and take in a relationship, those rewards and costs are very subjective. Now, this idea of comparison levels is really essential for social exchange theory. So you've got two different types of comparisons that we are said to make to help us determine whether or not the relationship is profitable. So comparison levels is the idea that an individual will typically, when getting into a new relationship, will compare their current partner with prior knowledge or experience. So you would compare your partner either to an ex, so to a previous relationship, or if you've not had a previous relationship and you have no one to compare them to, you might also compare your current partner to your societal expectations of a relationship. And those societal expectations can be developed from things like looking at role models, so looking at friends, parents, celebrity couples, kind of comparing yourself to others. It can be kind of dictated by things like the media. So, you know, what you might see in movies and books and online. So there's lots of different factors that could influence your comparison level, even if you've not had a previous partner. And what you tend to do is you compare these two relationships, you know, either previous or theoretical, and you think, is my current partner providing more rewards than costs in comparison to what I've had in the past? So is this relationship more profitable than what I either could or have already experienced? And if the relationship is more profitable than what we've had in the past, or if it meets the expectations of what we think we should be getting, we will maintain it. If we've had more profitable relationships in the past, or it's not meeting our expectations, the relationship is more likely to break down. Comparison level for alternatives is similar. However, this time it's about looking forward to future relationships, potential relationships that we haven't already had. So it's the idea of, you know, questioning, is the grass greener elsewhere? Or is the grass just green where you water it? And often it's the latter. If you're putting in that effort and time, a relationship can flourish. But in comparison level for alternatives, it's this idea that, would a new partner that I've not been with before, would they bring me more rewards? Again, could an alternative relationship be more profitable than my current one? And again, if it is, that's when the relationship would break down. If your current relationship is better or more profitable, then it will maintain and continue. Equity theory is very similar to social exchange, so it's still economic, it's still about rewards and costs, so there's lots of crossover between those theories. The main difference is that equity theory is about fairness in a relationship. So while social exchange is about profits and being more kind of, you know, having more rewards than costs, regardless of your partner, this is more about having fairness and consistency between both individuals in the relationship. So just a key exam tip here. Equity and equality don't mean the same thing. Equality would be referring to your partner and you having the same level of rewards and costs and getting the same types of rewards or having everything the same. Equity is about fairness. So it might be that one person puts slightly more in or gets slightly more out, but it has to be similar and it has to be fair for both parties. You can't have one person profiting and one person not being profitable. Otherwise, that's not going to work. So some examples for this one is this idea of inequity. So it suggested that if the relationship has positive inequity, this means that one person in the relationship is gaining more and therefore having lots of rewards while hardly any costs, and the other person is therefore not receiving a fair deal. Equally, negative inequity is what we call it when one person is under-benefiting instead of over-benefiting. So again, they're the one who's putting lots in and not receiving a lot in return. So what we want is an equitable relationship. Any type of inequity, whether it's positive or negative, is bad. And therefore, to achieve fairness in a relationship, often you will have to make adjustments. For example, having a joint bank account and equally paying the same amount of bills. In there, it might be things like creating a chores list so that you're divvying up the housework so everyone has a similar load. And that being said, it's all about it being kind of in line with what's fair. So when it comes to things like splitting bills, if you earn minimum wage and your partner's a millionaire, it needs to be comparable. Rather than just saying, let's split it down the middle, it might be that you pay a certain percentage or proportion that you can afford, so you're still contributing, but it is in relation and in line with what you are able to contribute, to keep it fair for both individuals, not just one person. Rusbult's investment model is the third and final theory of relationship formation and maintenance, and therefore it kind of combines the best elements of social exchange and equity and then adds a little bit more detail. So out of the three theories, I would say this is the most holistic and complete theory as far as formation theories go. So Rusbult identified that there are three factors that affect commitment, and that's what helps maintain a relationship. So in order for a relationship to be maintained, we must have high levels of commitment, and there are three things that would make us more or less committed. So the first one is satisfaction. So that's bringing in that knowledge from social exchange. If we are satisfied in a relationship, so if it's profitable, if we're getting lots of rewards and we're happy, we're going to be committed. If we feel like we're not getting as much as we're putting in and that the relationship's not profitable, we're not committed, we're not going to maintain. The second thing that affects our levels of commitment is comparison levels. So again, that's drawing upon knowledge of earlier theories. So comparison levels for alternatives in particular. This is saying, would I get more rewards from other people if the quality of the comparison for alternatives is high? We're going to feel less committed and we might be more inclined to leave the relationship or to engage in things like infidelity and cheating behaviours because we don't feel satisfied in our relationship. Equally, if our comparison for alternatives is low, then we think actually we're not going to get any better from anybody else and therefore very committed in my relationship, and you don't have to worry about doing anything that might possibly harm the relationship. The third factor, and this is something that's a little bit new, is looking at the role of investment, hence why it's the investment model. So investment refers to anything that you put into the relationship that you could risk losing if that relationship was said to break down. Now there's two different types of investment. You've got what you call intrinsic investment. So this is things that you directly put into the relationship, things like time, effort, love, possibly money, things that you directly have invested and tend to be things that are more personal. Whereas extrinsic is things that you have got out of the relationship, that again, you are more at risk of losing if that relationship was to no longer be. So good examples of extrinsic relationship investments in relationships are things like children, resources, so like a house or a car, and things like pets. Things that before the relationship you might not have had, but now that you've been with this person, they've enabled you to have a family, to have a child, to have a pet, to access more resources like houses and cars that maybe you couldn't have afforded on your own, but you can in a joint income situation. And it's suggested that the more investment that you have, the more committed you feel to that person, because you feel like, well, if I leave that relationship, I'm at risk of losing these investments. So commitment increases, and therefore so does maintenance. So a bit of an evaluation tip, a really good one there, is to bring in how it explains, for example, abusive relationships, because even though there is the negative cost of the abuse, the extrinsic investment of things like children and houses, they significantly outweigh those cons, and are valued as something that you need to keep and be committed to, otherwise you're at risk of losing. Now finally, the last theory for relationships is Duck's breakdown model. Now this is a phase model, so it's done in 4 different steps, in very much a linear fashion. So it's the belief that everybody goes through all 4 phases in that same order. An evaluation point is therefore that ignores individual differences and is very unlikely, but that is what the theory believes. And the key thing to note here is that it's a breakdown theory. It is all about breaking up with somebody. So if the exam question is phrased as relationship formation or maintenance, you could talk about the first 3 theories of social exchange, equity, and the investment model. But if the question explicitly says relationship breakdown, you could only get credit for talking about Duck. So only talk about duck if it says the word theories generically, or if it has the word breakdown in. So within Duck's phase model, there are 4 phases that you need to know, and at each of the 4 phases, there is a threshold. Now, the threshold is the point at which an individual can't stand that behaviour anymore, and it's kind of like the tipping point and kind of the element at which they've reached the end of that stage, and now they're starting to phase into the next part of the breakdown. So the first phase is the intrapsychic phase, and the kind of threshold here is I can't stand it anymore. This is where an individual is having their own internal dissatisfaction, so they've not yet told anyone about it, but everything that your partner's doing is really pissing you off and getting on your nerves, and it's that feeling of frustration towards the individual, and it's a heightened sense of stress because you've not yet shared that burden with your partner or with friends and family, so it's just you kind of building up that feeling of annoyance or frustration or upset towards how they're acting, and you start to become really unhappy. Once you've passed that threshold of I can't stand it anymore, you start to have those our relationship conversations with your partner in what we call the dyadic phase. So this is where you kind of have that chat with your partner, expressing that you're unhappy and any potential reasons why that might be. You give them an opportunity to respond, and during that phase, that's kind of the only point at which the relationship could be saved. So if any conflict is resolved during the dyadic phase, the relationship will no longer break down and is likely to maintain. However, because this has now been kind of aired and out in the open, it's likely that if conflict isn't resolved, you will reach that threshold of I would be justified in leaving, and then you would move on to that next stage. Now, the next stage is the social phase, which we are all probably very familiar with. This is about telling your family and friends about the possibility of a split, so getting their opinions and their advice. Friends will often kind of take sides or give their opinions on the situation at this point. And the threshold here kind of very much is you've reached that point where you don't feel that the relationship can be saved, and that things are going to start breaking down. And then finally, you've got the grave dressing phase. So the threshold here is, it's now inevitable. The relationship is very much in that state of breakup. And this is the point where people are wanting to save face and kind of give their side of the story. So you tend to find in the grave dressing phase, this is about you portraying the best version of yourself, you telling your own truth, kind of both people sharing their version of events to make sure they don't get portrayed as a bad person. And it's very much about kind of tidying up those memories and getting yourself in a state ready to move on to future relationships. Now, there is an additional 5th phase of this model that you could add in as a bit of stretch and challenge if you had time, and that is the resurrection phase. So that is very much the final stage of the process where you've maybe had a little bit of time to think through the breakup, and you mentally and psychologically prepare yourself to emotionally invest in another relationship, and you kind of get to that point where you're ready to move on and meet somebody new. Now, the resurrection phase is useful to help conclude the model, and it kind of feeds into evaluation points. However, it's not named on the spec, so you wouldn't get asked a question explicitly about that phase, whereas intrapsychic, dyadic, social and grave dressing, as they are labelled on the specification bullet points, you could get a question, maybe short answer, asking you specifically to outline one of those phases, or to do maybe like an application style question explaining, at what point this couple are in within Duck's phase model. On to booklet 4, which is virtual relationships. Now, this is a very small booklet because it's just basically building on your prior knowledge from factors affecting attraction and theories of relationships, and trying to explain how some of these concepts would differ in a more virtual world, because up until this point we've talked about the early origins of relationships in terms of evolution. We've talked about things that would make you more and less attracted to people and the reasons how and why we form and maintain relationships, but that's all purely based on face-to-face interactions and kind of the more traditional style of meeting somebody. Whereas now in a modern society, we're moving more to a virtual world, and particularly post-COVID and post the pandemic, where there's a lot more people engaging in long-distance relationships, online dating, using websites, social media, so things like Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, kind of dating apps, things like Tinder, Bumble, I could go on. So because people are using alternative methods to find either short-term or long-term relationships, we need to look at, well, what are the reasons why people are doing that, and how could that be affecting our communications? So the main two concepts to look at in virtual relationships, well, the first thing being that we know the definition of a virtual relationship. So this is referring to an online, non-physical interaction with somebody using purely the internet or social media, so like apps, websites, etc. The key thing here though is it's non-physical. So we are not referring to when you go on a date with somebody and then you're messaging them in between. It's not about using the combination of chatting to somebody online and then occasionally meeting up with them. This is the idea of people that have never met face to face and purely have a relationship just in an online and virtual setting. Once you've met face to face, your relationship would kind of be upgraded almost from virtual to just a normal relationship with the online interaction. But in terms of that phrase virtual relationship, this is talking about purely non-physical. And the main two things to look at within this is the idea of self-disclosure again, and the absence of gating mechanisms. So we already know from factors affecting attraction what self-disclosure is, but this is simply the idea that online, because we are in an anonymized state and we can put our best selves out there using things like filters and the best pictures of us, or if we really wanted to, I'm sure you've seen the Catfish documentary, and there's nothing stopping individuals from pretending to be somebody else. Because people don't truly know it's you, and people feel a lot less embarrassed about being honest about their actual kind of high-risk information. They might be more likely to share secrets and intimate details of their life a lot sooner than you would in a face-to-face relationship, because that removal of that barrier and that idea that, well, this person's unlikely to meet maybe your social circle of friends, they're not really going to tell anyone, it's a lot less risky because there's less pressure, means we actually self-disclose high-risk information much quicker, which helps build that bond and intimacy. So long-term, people actually feel that if they eventually do meet that person in real life, they already feel like they know them a lot quicker in comparison to if they've been dating for that period of time in the real world. And the absence of gating, so a gating mechanism is kind of that literal sense that when there is a gate, the purpose of that gate is to prevent you from going in somewhere or prevent something from getting in. So in the context of relationships, often, particularly when we're kind of just meeting or talking to somebody, we often put barriers in our own way and make excuses for not wanting to form personal connections with people. So for example, it might be, oh, well, I'm not physically attracted to them. Because I don't find them attractive, I'm not going to spend time getting to know them as an individual. And you automatically kind of put that wall up and that barrier, which prevents you from being able to get to know them further. Whereas online, because you can A, portray yourself in the best version of yourself, and B, there's kind of that minimization of the face-to-face interaction, there's less pressure. And because we've done the self-disclosure quickly, we almost see past the potential physical attractiveness or lack of, and because we feel like we know them much more intimately quickly, we don't really use that as a barrier, and regardless of that matching hypotheses, regardless of their level of physical attractiveness, we tend to be more open to being in a relationship with somebody online, because the normal barriers that would prevent us from wanting to get to know somebody are removed in that online kind of virtual world. And then the final booklet is parasocial relationships. So the key thing to remember is that a parasocial relationship is particularly looking at celebrity relationships. So relationships with high status and high profile individuals that are one-sided. So the key thing is, when previously talking about relationships, we're referring to this being like a reciprocal, two-way emotional bond. You know, it's a form of attachment, whereas a parasocial relationship is purely one-sided. This is the idea that that celebrity or high status person that we are kind of lusting after, they don't know you exist. So it is very much not your typical relationship that we would look at previously. Now, McCutcheon identified, using the celebrity attitude scale, that there are kind of 3 levels of parasocial relationship that people fall into. So the first one is entertainment social. Now, most people fall into this on the celebrity attitude scale. And this is simply just when you talk about your favourite celebrity, you engage in things like looking at their social media and checking in with what they're doing, and your infatuation with your favourite celebrity is very much surface level, just for entertainment purposes, because you like watching their movies or you like their music and you're invested. Intense personal is kind of, for example, those like mega fans, so people kind of like Swifties, Beliebers, people that kind of associate themselves with a wider group of people, and have, you know, a real intense love for that celebrity and real admiration. You might view them as someone, you know, that you have a real deep connection with. So it's a little bit more intense, hence intense personal. So that's kind of your mega uber fan category. And then borderline pathological, this is where it borders on kind of dangerous very maladaptive psychological behaviours, so things like stalking, kind of abnormal connections to these individuals, to the point where that you believe that if, for example, you were to turn up at their house, they would be happy to see you. So a very distorted and warped view of what that relationship looks like, and that's where kind of more detrimental behaviours can occur. And there's 2 main theories that help us explain these levels of parasocial relationships. The first one is the absorption addiction model. Now, this is the belief that certain people with deficiencies in their lives, for example, low self-esteem, any sort of potential past trauma, or those that are having kind of issues and crises with their own identity, they would absorb themselves into the lives of the celebrity so deeply and become so invested in them that they would start to view that relationship as an obsession. They would feel very much that they would know that individual, and become addicted to learning every aspect of their life. So kind of more explaining that borderline pathological behaviour, when people are so invested because of their own mental health problems. And there was kind of a correlation between those with experiences of things like depression or kind of high level trauma from their past. It was those individuals that were more likely to risk developing this high level of parasocial relationship through that absorption and addiction, to kind of fill in the deficiencies in their own lives and feel like they had a place to belong. So it filled that void of their lack of identity. And then the attachment theory really simply looks at childhood attachment, so looks at familiar concepts like secure, insecure avoidant, insecure resistant, and tries to identify which attachment style of those 3 would be more likely to develop a parasocial relationship and why. And out of the 3 common attachment styles, it was found that an insecure, resistant child would be more likely to develop a parasocial relationship because of that lack of consistency in their early childhood and that almost need for complete closeness but fear of rejection. So if we think back to the strange situation for a second, those children who were identified as insecure resistant, they had really clingy attachment behaviour. They were very distressed when the caregiver left, so high levels of separation anxiety and stranger anxiety. That can actually then explain why a parasocial relationship as an adult or as a young person would be more desirable. Because if you're in a parasocial relationship that is one-sided, where the other person doesn't know you exist, you can still invest all of that energy and feeling and clinginess into that person by showing that obsessive behaviour. However, because they don't know you exist, that other person can't physically reject you. If they don't know who you are, they can't say no. So you could have this perspective of, I love this person, we're going to get married, I'm the only one for them. Because they never get a message back that says, no, you're not, or they never get interaction from that celebrity, it's almost easier to have no interaction than it is to have a rejection. So it's the removal of that fear of rejection by opting for a one-sided relationship where that's not a possibility. So it kind of helps satisfy the significant worries and anxieties that a resistant child would have, and explains why certain people are more likely to develop a parasocial relationship in comparison to others. So obviously that is, as always, a whistle-stop tour of kind of the essential exam tips and AO1 knowledge for all of the, in this case, 5 key areas for the relationships topic. I hope you found that really useful. Like I said, if you need any support with AO3 and evaluation points, then comment down below and I can send you the link to Teams as to where to find kind of the top evaluation points. Also, another really useful tip is looking at past questions, looking at the examiner's comments, and looking at the mark schemes and seeing what the most frequent discussion points are that we do versus the ones on the mark scheme. And when you're trying to prioritise your evaluation revision and kind of which IEC paragraphs that you're more likely to include, I would kind of use the mark scheme as a guide because that's going to indicate to you what most examiners will be familiar with and what are the points that tend to get the most credit. So hopefully that's been really useful. I'm cracking on with recording the rest of the videos over the next couple of days. So the next video that you'll see uploaded on the channel is going to be aggression, because that's a big topic to tackle. So we need to get it done so you've got plenty of chance to go back over it before the exam. And then schizophrenia and issues and debates will come soon. Thanks, guys.